In today's modern cultures, marrying your cousin usually has some negative connotations. But for almost all of human history, cousins have been marrying cousins. And humans seem to be going strong with more than 7 billion individuals living right now. So is marrying your cousin really that bad? Howdy, I'm Andy Lee with Family History Fanatics, and this is a segment of DNA. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell if you want to be notified about new episodes. Today, we are talking about marrying your cousin. Now, I'm not saying you should go out and marry your cousin. What I want to talk about is how that affects our DNA and what we would see when that shows up. For many people, their family trees start to branch out. But when you have cousins marrying cousin, those trees don't branch, but they start to collapse in on themselves. For most of human history, we lived in rather isolated groups of a few hundred people, and we married within those groups. Now, because those groups were so small, it necessitated marrying relatives of ours. Now, usually, sibling pairing was forbidden, but for the most part, there was no taboo to first cousins or even second cousins marrying each other. There's a lot of famous people who actually married their cousins. Rudy Giuliani, Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and Charles Darwin all married either a first or second cousin of theirs. Even U.S. President Martin Van Buren and Vice President John C. Calhoun married one of their close cousins. In fact, it's estimated that 80% of all marriages throughout human history have been between first or second cousins. So really, not marrying your cousin is more of a modern invention. So what happens to your DNA when your tree doesn't branch because your group continued to marry within that group? From an evolutionary standpoint, marrying somebody not related to you introduces genetic diversity. Now, for the majority of our genes, there's not much difference between whether we marry a cousin or whether we marry somebody that we're completely unrelated to. It doesn't matter. Where problems can occur is with certain recessive detrimental genes. Recessive genes are not expressed unless you get 2 copies of that gene. A simple example that I've talked about in videos before is red hair. If you have red hair, then you have 2 copies of that red hair gene. But you can still be a carrier and have 1 copy of that gene, but you won't have red hair. For instance, my mother is a carrier of the red hair gene. That's because her father had red hair, so he had 2 copies and had to have passed one of those copies on to her. But me, even though I am my mother's son, I didn't get that copy of the red hair gene from her. All 3 of my brothers did, but I got left out. Now, if 2 carriers have children, then there is the possibility of their children having red hair. So my children can't have red hair because I'm not even a carrier of the gene. But since my brothers are all carriers of the gene, their children could have red hair if their spouses also had that red hair gene. Now, there have been a lot of studies of cousins and the amount of birth defects they have. And in fact, what has been shown is that cousins who marry actually have an increased rate of birth defects in their children. It goes from 2% to about 4%. But there's also lots of other factors that can affect whether or not you're going to have birth defects. Some of the most common ones are consumption of alcohol, or smoking while you're pregnant, or even being exposed to air pollution during that pregnancy. But it also means that 96% of children born to cousins don't have any birth defects. As with most things DNA, without knowing any specifics, think of it as a game of statistics. You share 12.5% of your DNA with the cousin that you're going to marry. That 12.5% came from one parent for both of you, and those parents were siblings. And then we get into a what-if game. Because of recombination, your children may get 0 of the recessive genes that you and your cousin's spouse's parents had. They may get 1 copy of a recessive gene, or they may get 2 copies of a recessive gene. It all depends on whether or not both of your parents were carriers and have that same recessive gene from their parents. Now, because you share 12.5% of your DNA, the probability of getting two recessive genes lies somewhere between 0% and 12.5%. Because both of you would need to have that recessive gene on that shared portion of DNA. And then both of you would have to pass on the recessive gene rather than the good gene from that shared portion of DNA. For comparison, siblings having children would have a much higher incidence of both birth defects and getting these recessive genes that could be detrimental. Their probability would lie between 0% and 50%. So in other words, don't marry your sibling. And if you want to marry your cousin, bad things probably aren't going to happen. If you're looking at marrying a second, third, fourth, fifth, or even more cousin, genetically, there's nothing to worry about. Now, if you have any questions about marrying your cousin, put it in the comments below. Make sure you give us a thumbs up and tell your friends if you like this video.